I never imagined that the simple act of cleaning out my basement would lead to something so shocking, so life-altering. At 64, I thought my life was over in many ways, until he walked in. My 27-year-old step-grandson, Bruce, with his confident smile and piercing eyes, turned my world upside down. That day, a photo from my youth sparked a conversation that would awaken desires I had buried for decades. What happened next changed everything. For most of my life, I had been the picture of responsibility, a loving wife, a devoted grandmother, and a woman who followed the rules. After my husband, David, passed away 12 years ago, I thought I had accepted the loneliness that came with widowhood. I kept myself busy with gardening, volunteering, and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But deep down, there was a restlessness I didn't dare acknowledge, a void I had lived with for so long that it felt like a part of me. David was a good man, reliable, steady, but distant. He wasn't one for grand gestures or passion. Over the years, I had convinced myself that stability was enough, that excitement and desire were fleeting things meant for the young. I buried my dreams of adventure and romance beneath the weight of practicality and duty. My step-grandson, Bruce, was a reminder of everything I had once found thrilling in life. The last time I saw him, he was a lanky 23-year-old fresh out of college, full of ambition and charm. 4 years later, he showed up unannounced, his confident stride and easy smile filling the quiet corners of my house. Now 27, he had grown into a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm intensity that drew people in. Seeing him again stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years. That fateful day began innocently enough. I had decided to tackle the basement, a dusty repository of forgotten memories. As I sifted through old boxes, I stumbled upon a photo album from my youth. There I was, laughing on a beach, wearing a bright orange bikini, radiating carefree joy. The image was like a window into a life I barely recognized, one filled with confidence and freedom I thought I had lost forever. When Bruce entered the room, I felt a mix of surprise and joy. His familiar smile put me at ease, but when his eyes landed on the photo in my hands, everything changed. His gaze lingered, a look of admiration crossing his face. "Is this you?" he asked, his voice laced with awe. That simple question reignited a spark inside me, a reminder of the woman I used to be. Little did I know, that moment was the beginning of something I could never have imagined. After that day in the basement, something shifted between Bruce and me. It wasn't anything overt, at least not at first, but there was an unspoken understanding, an energy in the air that hadn't been there before. Every glance he threw my way, every lingering moment of eye contact, seemed to carry a weight I couldn't ignore. It was subtle, but it was there, and it left me questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. Bruce's admiration was flattering, but it also made me uneasy. For years, I had seen myself as someone past her prime, invisible in a world that favored youth and beauty. But the way Bruce looked at me made me feel noticed, seen in a way I hadn't felt in decades. His words echoed in my mind, "You haven't aged a day." At first, I dismissed it as flattery, something polite young men say to their elders. But the sincerity in his voice, the way his gaze lingered on me, hinted at something more. The tension grew in small, almost imperceptible ways. Bruce began finding excuses to be around me, offering to help with mundane tasks or lingering a little longer than necessary after dinner. He had a way of making ordinary moments feel charged. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, he joined me on the couch. We talked about everything and nothing, his work, my memories of David, the things we had both been through. His tone was casual, but his eyes held a deeper intensity. "I've always admired you, Elizabeth," he said suddenly, his voice soft but steady. The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine. I laughed nervously, brushing off the compliment, but his gaze didn't waver. "No, I mean it. You're extraordinary." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to dismiss his words, to tell him he was being ridiculous. But another part of me, the part that had been starved for attention and affection, wanted to bask in them. It was wrong, I knew that, but it felt intoxicating. The moments of tension grew bolder. One afternoon, as I reached for a plate in the kitchen, Bruce came up behind me to grab a glass from the same shelf. His hand brushed against mine, lingering just a moment too long. I turned to look at him, expecting him to step back, but he didn't. Instead, he smiled, his eyes holding mine. "You're different from anyone I've ever met," he said quietly. His words were simple, but the way he said them made my heart race. I began to question everything. Was I imagining this? Was I projecting my own long-suppressed desires onto him, reading too much into his actions? But then there were moments that were impossible to ignore, like the way his hand would linger on my shoulder as he passed by, or the way he always seemed to find reasons to be near me. One evening, as we sat in the living room with a bottle of wine, the tension reached a breaking point. The conversation started innocently enough, reminiscing about the past and laughing about old stories. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere changed. Bruce leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost intimate tone. "You have no idea how incredible you are," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "It's like you don't even see it." I tried to laugh it off, to change the subject, but his words lingered. The air between us was heavy, charged with something I couldn't deny. My heart raced as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, but it left me breathless. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he looked at me, the things he said, it was wrong, but it felt so real, so undeniable. I told myself it was just a phase, that nothing would come of it. But deep down, I knew the line between us had already begun to blur. The tension between Bruce and me grew with every passing day, weaving itself into the fabric of our interactions. What had once been innocent and familial now felt charged, every glance and gesture layered with unspoken meaning. I told myself to stop, to draw a line and stay behind it. But the truth was, I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt alive, seen, and desired. It was a quiet evening when the line between us finally dissolved. Fiona, my daughter-in-law, had taken the kids to a weekend retreat, leaving the house silent except for the soft hum of the television in the background. Bruce and I sat on the couch, a bottle of wine between us, our conversation drifting from casual to deeply personal. He asked me about my life before David, about the things I'd wanted but never had. "Did you ever feel like there was more you could have done?" he asked, his voice low and sincere. I hesitated, the weight of his question settling over me. "Yes," I admitted finally. "There were so many things I dreamed of, adventure, passion, the kind of life that makes your heart race. But life has a way of reshaping those dreams." Bruce leaned closer, his green eyes locked on mine. "You're still that person, Elizabeth," he said softly. "I see it in you. You just need someone to remind you." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, to deflect the intensity of the moment, but he didn't look away. Instead, he reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. "You deserve to feel alive," he whispered. The room seemed to shrink around us, the space between us disappearing as he leaned closer. My heart pounded in my chest as his hand moved to my cheek, his touch gentle but deliberate. "Bruce, we can't," I murmured, though my voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" he asked, his tone steady. "You're not just my step-grandmother. You're a woman, a beautiful, incredible woman. And I can't stop thinking about you." Before I could respond, his lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as though he was testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, his hands finding their way to my waist. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, but my body refused to listen. For the first time in years, I felt wanted, cherished, and alive. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes searched mine, as if looking for reassurance. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice tinged with guilt. "But I don't regret it." I didn't know what to say. The rational part of me wanted to scold him, to end this before it went any further. But another part, the part one had buried for so long, wanted nothing more than to lose myself in his embrace. And that part won. From that moment on, everything between us changed. The stolen glances turned into fleeting touches, and the fleeting touches turned into secret moments. We began finding excuses to be alone, a trip to the grocery store, an evening walk, even small household chores. Each encounter brought us closer, the tension between us building to a fever pitch. One afternoon, as we stood in the kitchen washing dishes, he reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to hold back with me." I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his gaze. "This is wrong," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Then why does it feel so right?" he countered, stepping closer. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine again, this time more urgent, more insistent. The dishes were forgotten as he pulled me into his arms, his hands tracing the curve of my back. I melted into him, the world around us fading away. Our relationship became a series of stolen moments, each one more intense than the last. We found ourselves drawn to each other like magnets, unable to resist the pull. The thrill of what we were doing, the danger of being caught, only added to the intensity. Every touch, every kiss felt like a rebellion against the years of loneliness and conformity I had endured. Yet amidst the passion, there was always a shadow of guilt. I knew what we were doing was wrong, that it could never last. But for those fleeting moments, none of that seemed to matter. In Bruce's arms, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in decades. And I wasn't ready to let that go. The secret moments Bruce and I shared had become the center of my world, a dangerous escape from the monotony of my life. We thought we were careful, that no one would suspect the connection we were hiding. But secrets, especially ones as explosive as ours, have a way of surfacing when you least expect it. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, a rare day when the whole family was together. Fiona had planned a barbecue, inviting friends and relatives to join us in the backyard. I busied myself with the preparations, trying to keep my thoughts in check. Bruce was there too, effortlessly charming everyone with his easy smile and quick wit. But beneath the surface, there was an undeniable current between us, a shared glance here, a brush of the hand there. The tension was almost unbearable. I had to remind myself to stay composed, to avoid doing anything that would raise suspicion. But as the day wore on, the boundaries we had been so careful to maintain began to blur. At one point, I caught Bruce looking at me from across the yard, his green eyes filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. I quickly looked away, but the damage was done. Fiona, standing nearby, noticed the exchange. "What was that about?" she asked casually, her tone light but her eyes narrowing slightly. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "He was probably just asking if I needed help with the food." Fiona didn't press the issue, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. For the rest of the afternoon, I avoided Bruce, hoping to diffuse any suspicion. But the more I tried to distance myself, the more obvious it seemed. By the time the guests began to leave, I could feel Fiona's gaze on me, sharp and probing. The confrontation came later that night. I was in the kitchen, tidying up after the barbecue, when Fiona walked in. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone was cold. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. My heart sank. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not blind, Elizabeth. I've seen the way you and Bruce look at each other." I froze, the air leaving my lungs. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said weakly, but my voice betrayed me. "Don't lie to me," Fiona snapped, her voice rising. "I've seen it, the glances, the way you light up when he's around. Something's going on, and I want the truth." For a moment, I considered denying it, clinging to the flimsy facade we had built. But the look in Fiona's eyes stopped me. She already knew. There was no point in lying anymore. "It's not what you think," I began, my voice trembling. "Bruce and I, it's complicated." "Complicated?" Fiona repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "He's your step-grandson, Elizabeth. How could you even think this was okay?" Tears welled in my eyes as the weight of her words sank in. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I whispered. "I was lonely, and he made me feel alive again." Fiona's expression hardened. "Alive? Is that your excuse? You've destroyed any chance of this family staying together. And for what? A fling?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Bruce walked into the room. He must have heard the raised voices because his face was tense, his eyes darting between Fiona and me. "What's going on?" he asked cautiously. Fiona turned on him, her voice sharp. "Why don't you tell me, Bruce? What's going on between you two?" Bruce hesitated, his face pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Fiona snapped. "I saw the way you were looking at her today, and the way she was looking back. Just admit it." Bruce glanced at me, his expression filled with guilt and fear. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, the weight of the truth pressing down on all of us. Then, he took a deep breath and said the words that shattered everything. "It's true," he admitted quietly. "I care about her." The room fell silent, Fiona staring at him in disbelief. "You care about her," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's your grandmother, Bruce. Do you even hear yourself?" "I know how it sounds," Bruce said, his voice steady. "But it's not what you think. It's more than that." Fiona's face twisted in anger. "More than that. It's disgusting. How could you do this? How could either of you do this?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice breaking. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Well, you did, Fiona said coldly. You've destroyed this family. I hope it was worth it. She stormed out of the room, leaving Bruce and me standing in stunned silence. The weight of what had just happened was suffocating, the reality of our actions crashing down around us. For the first time, I fully understood the magnitude of what we had done and the damage we had caused. That night, Bruce and I sat together in silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The thrill, the passion, the forbidden excitement, it had all led to this. A moment of truth that left nothing but devastation in its wake. I'm sorry, Bruce said quietly, his voice filled with regret. I didn't mean for this to happen. Neither did I replied, tears streaming down my face. But it did. And now we have to live with the consequences. The aftermath of Fiona's discovery was as painful as it was inevitable. The confrontation had torn apart the fragile facade we'd maintained, leaving no room for denial or repair. Fiona packed her things and left with the children the very next morning, her face etched with anger and heartbreak. She refused to speak to me, her silence heavier than any words she could have said. Bruce and I were left alone in the house, but it was no longer a sanctuary. The walls that had once held our secret now felt oppressive, filled with the echoes of everything we'd done and everything we'd lost. We avoided each other, the weight of our actions pressing down like a physical force. Fiona's departure set off a chain reaction. Word spread quickly among the family, and soon, the phone calls began. My siblings, cousins, and even distant relatives called to express their shock and disgust. Some of them demanded answers, while others simply hung up after hurling insults. The shame was unbearable, but what stung most was the realization that I had no defense. I couldn't justify what I had done, not to them, not to myself. Bruce faced his own share of consequences. His parents, who had always been proud of his achievements, were devastated. They refused to let him visit their home, cutting him off with cold finality. His friends, too, turned away, unable or unwilling to reconcile the man they knew with the choices he had made. He lost job opportunities, connections, and a sense of belonging, all for something that had spiraled out of control. For weeks, the house was steeped in silence. I spent most of my days in the garden, avoiding the rooms where the memories of our affair were strongest. Bruce stayed in his room or left for hours at a time, returning late at night with a haunted look in his eyes. We had both thought that what we shared was worth the risk, but now, it was clear that the cost was far greater than we had anticipated. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Bruce joined me. For a long time, we said nothing, the weight of our shared guilt hanging heavy in the air. Finally, he broke the silence. I think I need to leave, he said quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his turmoil. What we did, it's destroyed everything. I nodded, my throat tight. I understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's probably for the best. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I don't regret how I felt about you, he said finally. But I regret everything it cost. His words cut deep, but they also brought a strange sense of closure. I don't regret feeling alive again, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. But I regret hurting the people we love. Bruce left the next morning, taking only a small suitcase and a heavy heart. Watching him drive away was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it was necessary. Staying together would only prolong the pain, making it impossible for either of us to heal. In the weeks that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my life. I reached out to Fiona, apologizing over and over again, but she refused to respond. I wrote letters, hoping that putting my feelings into words might help her understand, but they all went unanswered. The silence was crushing, but I knew I had no right to expect forgiveness. Therapy became my refuge, a place where I could confront the choices I had made and the person I had become. My therapist helped me see the patterns in my life, the loneliness, the longing for validation, the way I had let my needs go unmet for so long that I was willing to risk everything for a fleeting sense of fulfillment. It was painful, but it was also necessary. The house, once filled with life and laughter, became a hollow shell. I considered selling it, but I couldn't bear to leave the memories behind, not just of Bruce, but of David, of Fiona, of the life I had built and lost. Instead, I slowly began to rebuild, starting with small steps. I joined a community center, began volunteering at a local shelter, and reconnected with old friends who were willing to look past my mistakes. Bruce and I never spoke again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved to another state, starting fresh in a place where no one knew his past. I hoped he found peace, though a part of me knew that the scars we had left on each other would never fully heal. Looking back, I see our affair for what it truly was, a symptom of deeper wounds, a desperate attempt to fill the voids in our lives. It wasn't love, not really. It was a mistake, one that cost us both more than we ever could have imagined. The aftermath of our choices left me in a place I never thought I'd be, isolated, estranged, and forced to confront the person I had become. The life I had known was gone, shattered by a series of decisions that I could never undo. For a long time, I was consumed by guilt, reliving every moment and wondering how I had let things spiral so far out of control. But amidst the wreckage, I found something unexpected, a chance to rebuild. It didn't come easily, nor did it come all at once. It started with acceptance, accepting that I had hurt the people I loved, that my actions had consequences, and that the only way forward was to learn from my mistakes. I began to see my affair with Bruce not as a testament to passion or love, but as a symptom of a deeper emptiness I had ignored for too long. In therapy, I learned to look inward, to understand the loneliness that had driven me to such reckless behavior. For years, I had buried my needs, convincing myself that they didn't matter. I had lived for others, first for David, then for my family, until I didn't know who I was anymore. My relationship with Bruce, as wrong as it was, forced me to confront those feelings, to see the parts of myself I had tried to ignore. I reached out to Fiona again and again, apologizing not just for what I had done but for the pain I had caused her. It took months of letters, messages, and unanswered phone calls, but eventually, she agreed to meet. Sitting across from her in that small cafe, I saw the hurt in her eyes, the anger that hadn't fully faded. But I also saw a glimmer of understanding. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I can see that you're trying. And maybe that's a start." Her words brought me a sense of hope I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward healing, a small crack in the wall that had grown between us. Over time, I began to find pieces of myself I thought I had lost. I immersed myself in community work, joining groups that helped widows and the elderly find purpose and connection. I shared my story, not the scandalous parts, but the lessons I had learned about loneliness, desire, and the importance of confronting your emotions before they control you. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn was about boundaries. What I had with Bruce wasn't love, it was a desperate attempt to fill a void, to reclaim a sense of youth and excitement I thought I had lost. But love isn't about filling voids, it's about building something real, something grounded in trust, respect, and mutual understanding. I had mistaken attention for affection, admiration for love, and the cost had been devastating. As the years passed, the sharp edges of my guilt began to soften. I never forgot what I had done or the pain it caused, but I learned to forgive myself, not to excuse my actions but to acknowledge that I was human, flawed, and capable of growth. I began to see my mistakes as lessons, reminders of the importance of honesty, self-awareness, and the courage to face your emotions head-on. Today, I live a quieter life. My relationship with Fiona is still strained, but we've found a fragile truce, one built on mutual effort and time. My grandchildren are cautious around me, their trust slow to return, but I'm patient. I know that rebuilding those relationships will take years, if not a lifetime. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: life doesn't give you many chances to rewrite the past, but it always offers opportunities to write a better future. Mistakes don't define us, how we respond to them does. And while I'll never forget the choices that brought me here, I've learned to forgive myself and move forward. What would you have done if you were in my position? Have you ever faced a moment where one choice changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that delve into the complexities of life, love, and betrayal. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next story. It's even more shocking than this one.